Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to my channel. I am Monet and you're watching Life is Monet. I do not always talk about nonfictions on my channel, but I'm trying to do more this year. I'm trying to do better this year. And I have, of course, the Not a Book Club that me and Erin do, and we read a nonfiction a month, and we host a live show that rotates between my channel and her channel. And this month we will be reading New Age of Empire: How Racism and Colonialism Still Rules the World. The live show for this will be over on Erin's channel later on in this month, so I will put the details for that in the description box. Always follow us on Instagram and Twitter so you guys can get updates for when we decide the day of the live show will be on. But this is for later on in this month. In this video, we're going to talk about the nonfictions that I read in February. I decided that it might be a little too much work for me to go back and talk about all of the nonfictions that have shaped my life and my perspective of the world. And so I want to give updates about nonfictions as I read them throughout the year, but I will do a video that I'm sorry, I just got a text message and drama is happening and I can't respond to that right now because I'm filming, but now I'm gonna be thinking about that the whole video. That's crazy. Oh wow. Oh wow. Wow. More texts are coming in. That's crazy. I forgot what I was gonna say. Yes, I will do sorry about that. I will do I can't with the text messages right now. Hold on, please. If I can compose my thoughts, I'm gonna put my phone on Do Not Disturb so I don't see these text messages anymore. What was I saying? Yes, I will do a video that comprises of what I consider to be my favorite nonfictions, but since some of the ones mentioned in this video won't be in the favorites, I'm doing a separate review video. So the first one I have is an Indigenous people's history of the United States. And when I say that I loved this book. So Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, I don't know if she is Indigenous, but I know for a fact that she has a degree, either her master's or her PhD in history. I wrote my undergrad capstone paper on Mexican American immigration policies, and I had to cover a variety of aspects in terms of Mexican American relations and how Americans saw Mexicans between 1901 to 1935, and there was no way, of course, for me to fully cover the scope of Mexican treatment of citizens and immigrants during that time period without talking about the indigenous ties and how that shaped how America saw Mexicans. And so she has another book that she wrote that's called Not a Nation of Immigrants. And so I've already read from her before, and I read that book. I really enjoyed it. I loved it. And I was just like, wow, this is if I was ever going to be a historian, if I was ever going to go get my PhD to become a history writer or a professor, this is what I would want to do. She is such an inspiration in the way that she writes. And she doesn't have this American exceptionalism view, but also I don't think that she's extremely cynical. She talks very straightforward. This is what happened. This is what it was. She doesn't over exaggerate, but she also doesn't throw things under the bus. And so when I read Not a Nation of Immigrants, I really loved it. And so seeing this, I was like, okay, I already know this author, I already loved her, I'm gonna pick it up. And this one did not disappoint. From the two books that I've read, both of them were 5 stars, and I rarely rate nonfictions. And so if I was going to recommend anyone, it would be this author. She starts from a very interesting point that I really enjoyed, because she tells a full layout of the indigenous civilizations, not just tribes, but entire entire indigenous empires that existed between Mesoamerica, which would be Central and Latin America today, all the way up to America, the United States. And she describes how they interacted with one another, how they had entire government structures, hierarchies. They had entire trade routes. They also had these entire economic structures. And so these were essentially, for this time frame, thriving civilizations. And we only really focus on like the Greek civilizations, the Romans, the Egyptians, sometimes there's the Persians and the Ottomans, but like in terms of early civilizations, there's never a huge emphasis on the Mesoamericans, the Mayans and the Aztecs that formulated this continent before it was colonized. And I think that it was such a great decision to start from there, to paint this picture, because you understand that these are not just barbaric savages that only exist within their own tribes and they just live very secluded and reclusive from one another. They spoke, they traded, they taught, they traded cultures and ways of living and just so many things. And so when she gets into the early colonization and some of the brutalities that occurred when these settlers arrived, you immediately understand what they disrupted. Not from the colonizers' standpoint, but like what was here, what pre-existed, and why it benefited them. Because they did not come, one of the things that she mentions in this book, and like I highlighted so much and like wrote in this book, but one of the things that she talks about is that with England being so far away across an ocean, they did not have the means, the system, or the finances to completely start from the ground up all of the different places that they were colonizing. And so when these colonizers came, they added on to the trade routes that were already there. They added on to the entire living structures, socioeconomic structures, infrastructures that were built by indigenous tribes, and they expanded upon it. If these indigenous civilizations did not exist prior, if this was just completely undisturbed land that had not been cultivated. Hi guys, I am editing Monet and I have decided to disrupt this scheduled program to read an excerpt from the book itself, because I feel like what she wrote was a better worded example of what I was trying to summarize in this clip. But in the book, it says that many have noted that had North America been a wilderness, underdeveloped, without roads, and uncultivated, it might still be so, for the European colonies could not have survived. They appropriated what had already been created by indigenous civilizations. They stole already cultivated farmland and the corn and vegetables, tobacco, and other crops domesticated over centuries. They took control of deer parks that had been cleared and maintained by indigenous communities. They used existing roads and water routes in order to move armies and to conquer, and relied on captured indigenous people to identify the locations of water, oyster beds, and medical herbs. European explorers and invaders discovered an inhabited land. Had it been pristine wilderness then it would possibly still be so today, for neither the technology nor the social organization of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries had the capacity to maintain of its own resources outpost colonies thousands of miles from home. They were incapable of conquering true wilderness. The Europeans were highly competent in the skill of conquering other people. And that is what they did. They did not settle a virgin land. They invaded and displaced a resident population. That is so simple a fact that it is self-evident. And she even talks about the decision of some tribes to own Negro slaves, and how it was either one forced upon them or they had to assimilate into what was now American culture. And we know from early immigrants, one of the ways to assimilate into American culture, especially during this time period, was to mimic white American ways. And that would be to be racist, to be xenophobic, and to own Negro slaves. And so some of these tribes, for survival, tried to assimilate to that way of life. And how there were other tribes that were like, this is not how you do this. And they're lying to you. They're never going to accept you. And so that would also cause them to go to war with one another, because this battle between shedding your values and your communities and like what you hold dear just to capitulate to someone who's never gonna invite you into their society also cause more friction. And so yeah, this is one I definitely recommend. I have read quite a few Indigenous nonfiction and like Indigenous literature, and so if you guys want more recommendations, leave that down in the comment section below. This is just the one that I read in February. The second nonfiction that I read in the month of February was Blood and Iron, and this was our Not a Book Club pick, and the live show was on my channel. It was very short, very matter of fact. I think that the book was 250 pages, 240 pages, so it is extremely short. I don't think that the author does any type of dramatics. Like, I was surprised to learn that the author was a journalist, because usually when journalists write nonfiction, they normally write it in a way to entice the reader and make them feel like they're not reading a nonfiction. But Katya did not do that, and so I found this book like kind of hard for me to just run through, because it's so short that you're just like, oh, I'm gonna finish this in a second. But it's really just throwing a bunch of facts at you. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Not all nonfictions are gonna be extremely engaging, and I feel like for what she set out to do, she accomplished in this book. We're talking about what is considered the Second Reich and like the entire formalization of Germany, and how it was really just a dream and a thought and a whim, and how Bismarck, which is kind of like their chancellor, like the person who really united them and formulated this nationality around what it means to be German, how he had to maneuver a very fragile system and a very delicate balance between all of these different separate sovereign kingdoms, and get them to give up their power, their separate power, and come together for a collective. And he did that through Blood and Iron. These were separate kingdoms that often had to come together to fight against the French and to fight wars of aggression, and they only found unity through war. And so he used that as a tool to be wielded to formulate Germany through war, through Blood and Iron. And it sets the stage for the Third Reich, which was the Nazi regime, and Hitler. And everyone knows that Hitler was very upset after the First World War, and he wanted to return Germany to its greatness. But if you're someone who doesn't really know what the greatness was, this is the book. This is the book that's going to make you understand what it was he wanted to return Germany to. I gotta check my phone. I'm sorry. The third nonfiction was Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. I had feelings about this book. There was nothing inherently wrong with the book, but where the author chose to start, because the author is actually a historian. I think she has a PhD in history, and she's a history professor. So yeah, she's actually a professor of history, and she started in a very odd place. I feel like nothing happens separate. Nothing really in America is an isolated incident. And there is a point in which this idea would come about, and it would formulate in the minds of American citizens, even from the inception of America as a country. And that idea morphed and changed into multiple different realizations. And all of that contributes to what we have as evangelicals today. And so the point in history that I expected her to start at, she did not. Not necessarily a bad thing. However, in proving her point in this book, she eventually had to bring that in. And I feel like bringing it in after the fact is kind of like a weak way of doing that. I know that this sounds very odd, but I'm trying not to like overload you guys with historic facts. But what I thought she was going to start with was Puritans and the idea of the city on the hill and the separatists who wanted to formulate America as the new Mount Zion, the new Jerusalem. They were going to be what the Hebrews were supposed to be. And they came here with this notion of, we're going to lead people on the right path. We're going to be this example and make America this example of a country of God in Christ. And then there's another aspect where we have Calvinist people who come from they're like Scots-Irish immigrants, and they kind of militarize Christianity. And Christ to them was a warrior, or someone who understood the brutalities of war in the name of God. And I'm being very simplistic here, so don't take me at face value. Definitely go and read it yourself. But these two ideologies, one of predetermination, predestination, of when I take this land and build these empires and, you know, do all these things and become rich, this is what God has already ordained for me to be because of predetermination. God has decided before we're born who's going to be saved and who's going to be damned. And there's no way for you to really know if your soul has already been saved or already been damned. And so one of the ways that you can verify that, or that they chose to verify that, was through the quality of their life. If you are someone who was wealthy and educated, you had land, you had slaves, you are clearly the embodiment of a saved soul. You were predetermined to go to heaven. You were predetermined to salvation, and that shows in your life. And those who are losing these wars and that are enslaved, they were predetermined to be slaves. And now I'm talking about, like, you know, the enslavement of people, but really I'm focusing on the predetermination. And so when we get manifest destiny, this is us becoming what God has already ordained for us to be. We're supposed to spread from sea to shining sea. This is what it's supposed to be. And so all of the people who die, and all of the blood that we spill, all of the slaves that we bring aboard, this is what God wanted life to be. But she didn't start there. She chose to tell her story in a different way. She started from the early 1900s, so America has already kind of been here. And there is a group of Christians who feel like America is losing its way. They're losing the traditional and conservative values that they've always had. Life is changing. Women are going to work. Industries and factories are coming in. Nobody's, you know, staying at home, little house on the prairie. We're not milking the cows anymore. Like, technology is coming in, and they are uncomfortable in this movement, this way of change. And for them, God and Christ is a hierarchy with the Father at the top, and women working disturbs that. It's supposed to be a hierarchy. And so in the home, it's also supposed to be a hierarchy of a patriarchy. And you start to see these early formulations of people who want to uphold traditional values and conservative values. And they start to go against anything that looked different. And I think she does a good job of showing what evangelicals were originally inspired by, what their original goals and narratives was, and all of the turning points in American history that shaped evangelicals. And they've started to become something different. And she goes all the way up to Trump's presidency. And she pretty much talks about how they were a cover for white supremacists, for homophobic people, for sexist, misogynistic people, for those who were just rich, wealthy white men. They become this beard to hide, and they start to use evangelical as like this holy weapon to wield, to camouflage a lot of the ill-intended and like nefarious objectives behind what it is they're doing. And by the time we get from the early 1900s to Trump's presidency, they have lost control of their narrative. They have complete control of the Republican Party. Now the Republican Party cannot get a president elected without having the evangelical vote. The evangelical goal and like original objective is being held hostage by the people who are hiding under their umbrella, but also the Republican Party is now being held hostage by the evangelicals. And it paints this picture of why the Republican Party is kind of very polarized and they don't know what to do after Trump, because a lot of the most respected evangelical pastors spoke out against Trump. And it used to be this movement where we listened to our leaders. And now is, if you speak out against Trump, your patrons, your congregation will leave your church. And just this moment in the book where these evangelical leaders and ministers realize that they have lost control of the church, they've lost control of the narrative, they no longer have the mic. Trump is now their savior. It was very interesting to follow. So I will say that like she still accomplished her mission. I'm just like shocked that as a historian, she chose to start from that point, because using Christianity as a militant aspect or wielding Christianity in a military way has always been in American history since the beginning of time. And now it's being wielded as evangelicals, but those early concepts are now under this evangelical umbrella. So yeah, I have conflicting feelings. I still recommend it. I still did like it, and it was very interesting. So after reading that book, my brain was just turning, because that's what it does. And I have ADHD, so I hyper focus on things. I came to this idea of, and I don't mean this outside of like the way that I'm saying it, is that white Christ and black Jesus, two different people. Two different people. When our grandparents and our ancestors turned to Jesus, it was not as a military figure. It was not through predestination. It was more through liberation. A lot of our success and progression in civil rights and equal justice in America has been through this launch pad of the black church. It used to be extremely important in almost all movements, even the abolitionist movement. The black church played a really big part. And so I wanted to explore more of the differences of what Jesus means to African Americans versus what it means to like evangelicals, because again, we don't see it as a justification of war. A lot of us don't see it as a reason to uphold a patriarchy or a hierarchy. We don't necessarily feel threatened when life starts to change. It's very different. And so I picked up Red Lip Theology, which is a autobiography about a black woman who was raised in church, and she went to school for theology. And so I think she's an ordained minister, ordained pastor. I'm not sure, but she did go to school for it. I don't know if she's currently preaching, but she talks about her mother getting pregnant at a young age and the shame that she felt at church, and the way that they treated her, the things that they said about her mother. But her mother, as a single woman, as a single black woman, chose to still go to church and deal with it because she needed the support of the church community and the black community, and she didn't have help with her daughter, and so she felt like the best way that she could make sure her daughter was fully protected was through God and through the black congregation. And she is growing up in this environment, and she's starting to question her relationship with God and what he means to her, and whether or not she is in alignment with the church, whether she wants to stay in the church, and just pretty much what her religion means to her. And I feel like her journey to break away, or this process of possibly breaking away from the black church, is something that a lot of us, especially our age, is happening more and more. And whenever I read a book about someone who chose to break away from the church, I usually understand them. I can empathize with them. But this book I really enjoyed because she goes through the radicalization and the revolution of how she sees herself as a Christian, how she sees church, and how she wants to have a relationship with God. And she chooses to stay in the church, but in her own way. And I thought that that was very powerful. I think that there needs to be more books like that, of you can be aware of the corruption of a church, how the church can be abusive, how the church can treat women, especially black women, and especially women that they don't find to be chaste and pious, how they embarrass and shame women who get pregnant. And she talks about her journey of going to school and her leaving her predominantly black church and going to school with white Christians. And there's a moment in the book where she talks about like evangelicals and like how it was so different for her. I think that this book was really good. It was a really good read. I've already recommended it to so many people as well, because I have so many women in my life that have again started to question whether or not the church was a great place to be, and question the toxicness of a church, and have decided to still engage in the community in their own way, still have a relationship with God in their own way, without completely breaking apart. And so if you're interested in a book like that, I would recommend this one. It's very short, but I really did enjoy it. So the next two books that I read was The 1619 Project and 400 Souls. Now, The 1619 Project was pretty interesting because I seen it everywhere, especially because we know that like it caused a huge uproar of like critical race theory, and there's even books out that are like combating the truth of this and people who really dislike it. But I think that it is a full, complete, comprehensive history of black people in America, from the earliest forms of what we know occurred that have been verified in our history, all the way up to today. It goes through everything. And I am extremely hard to please, as you can tell, because I took apart Jesus and John Wayne, because if you're going to tell a book that talks about history, I don't like when history leaves out context. I don't like when they paint a one-sided or like loose-sided picture. And so when I was going into this book, I had like this personal mini list of things I was going to wonder if she was covering. Like, I wonder if she'll talk about this or about that. She hit every single one. I don't think that she left a stone unturned that was a requirement to unturn. Like, things that you see on social media of like race riots and black towns and neighborhoods that were destroyed, and like all these different things that occurred in black history that it's like you hear it and you're like, I never knew that, or nobody ever talks about that, and why is that hitting? She talks about it all in this book, and I am impressed. I am impressed. I learned a few things, even like with all of the history that I know in my head. I still learned going into this book. And so for that alone, I still think that it's worth the money, it's worth the investment. And also it's nice to have one solid book to refer back to that covers over 400 years of history, all the way up to even after Trump's presidency, that I can now immediately go to and quote and pull from, instead of having to go through all these separate books to find the information or to cite the information that I'm looking for. And with that being said, I would recommend this. I think it should be required reading, especially for African American adults, but also those that really want to understand how deep the mistreatment of black people goes in America. And she talks about the black church in here. She talks about our music. She talks about us in acting. She talks about even so much. There's a chapter literally on highways, how cities like Atlanta or cities that are predominantly black have really bad traffic congestion, and how that was done purposely, sending these highways and all of these major streetways through these black neighborhoods was done on purpose to disrupt the harmony of these neighborhoods. I don't think that it's extremely brutal. I don't think that it's hard to read, but I do think that you will want a physical copy because you're going to want to take notes. I wrote so many things throughout this book. I took so many notes in the book, you can see. So like my copy is extremely well loved in the time that I read it. And so since I read that one and I already owned 400 Souls, I thought it would be the perfect time to pick it up. Now, while that one covers everything from like laws and legislations and different events in history and people in history that matters, this one is more of like a humanities, like social standpoint, because it tells history through stories. And so if you're someone who becomes overwhelmed with a bunch of facts being thrown at you back to back, I think 400 Souls is a great place to start, because the short mini anecdotes or like fictional stories will give the effects and how different laws or like events played out, and it'll tell it to you from that standpoint and then go into like the laws. So I think that it's a great balance for someone who may become overwhelmed or is not really into history like that, to have the law or like the event that made this happen, and then also to have a little story or poem where you see the actual effects of it play out. Again, this was another one that's not heavy filled with trauma, so you don't have to worry about that. But either one of these two, I will recommend, especially if you start with 400 Souls. I think that it will perfectly prepare you to read something like the 1619 Project. If you're going to choose one, I would say go with the 1619 Project. It had a pretty good audiobook, but if you're trying to expand your book collection and also your reading, 400 Souls is a book I would recommend as well. Now, the last two books that I read, I'm gonna give a little disclaimer for them. I am married to a black man, and I remember telling him a while ago that I was a little confused as to like the black narrative for black men ongoing currently, because I'm like, who is leading the charge? Who is painting the future, laying out the railroads? Who are you guys coming to kumbaya with? Because lately all I've seen is really Dr. Umar Johnson and then that Kevin Samuel guy on YouTube who hates women. And every now and again I try to read books that are targeted towards black men or black boys to see if maybe there's been a change or a different direction. And I am usually kind of disappointed. I'm usually like, I have a nephew, you know what I'm saying? I have little boys in my life, and maybe I'll have a son one day, and I want to be able to show them real life current examples and not just pictures of people who have passed in textbooks or black and white photos. Like, I'm not saying that we need to have a new Martin Luther King. However, it is so easy for a black woman to find nonfiction books by authors and activists and just people in general, black women, as examples of the direction that black women are moving in. And it's so easy to find that inspiration and that kinship with other successful black women that are doing the work and taking charge. And like, I'm like, okay, where's that for the black men? And I have been having a bit of a hard time finding it. So if you guys know, leave them down in the comment section. I definitely want to read them. I have read Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. I've read Dear Martin. But outside of books that combat gun violence and drug dealing and going to prison, are there any other books outside of that, like outside of avoiding the street life? Maybe books about becoming a father, being an involved father, an active father, anything like that? I've been looking for them. So with that being said, there was an extremely popular book from this YouTube person called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, and I was seeing it everywhere, and I was just like, I don't know, like, I haven't really been satisfied with the literature and stuff that I've been reading, so I didn't read that. But this book did so well, and now there is a young adult, middle grade version of the book called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Boy, and I decided to try to read that one. And it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. The author opens the book telling the reader, telling the young white reader, because it's actually a open letter kind of to white people, to white adults and children who may be racist or may be continuing racist ideals without really knowing it. And he opens the book telling the reader a little bit about himself, and then he opens the floor, I guess, for them to engage in an uncomfortable conversation about race with a black man. I think that one of the reasons why it would be an uncomfortable conversation is the way that black men are depicted in the media and in books and in TV shows and stuff like that. So I was just like, okay. He is a second generation Nigerian American, and so he discusses how he went to a predominantly white school. He was a token black because he played sports that heavily shaped his view of other black people. And so when he did see other black kids that showed up to his school, he immediately assumed that they must be there for sports because he was so used to black people being athletes to get into a school. And he always felt very disconnected from popular black culture, and so he chose to call himself Nigerian American or just Nigerian, and all of this stuff shaped his life, and he didn't really become black until college. College is when he really connected with like the black community and like started to understand what it means to be black. I don't know, like I know for a fact that I don't have the authority to be like, oh, you want to talk about race with a black man, or you want to have an uncomfortable conversation with a black man? I don't have the authority to do that. However, I don't know how much authority he has either. It's very weird. I'm not trying to say that he's not black, but it should have been called Let's Talk About Race. I don't think that he should have focused on being black in the title of that book, because none of the depictions of black men, I think, applies to him. And it's hard to offer yourself up as this mouthpiece, as this spokesperson, as this educator from the black community. Let's engage, let's have these conversations. It's hard for me to see you being the person to do that when you kind of just connected with the black community. It didn't really happen until you got to college. So I think I would have been more comfortable if the book had a different title. I don't know how invested in the black community you have to be to have a conversation like that. But it's weird to give your book that title and then open up the book with that. Besides that, another reason I didn't like the book is I felt like he tried to capitulate to the white reader so much. He was going out of his way not to say the uncomfortable thing when this is supposed to be an uncomfortable conversation about race with a black man. I felt like he was going out of his way to do the Carlton, if I'm being honest. Like, beating around the bush, and I'm not saying you're racist, but hear me out. Here's my point of view. What if I said this? And like, it was just like, you're trying so hard not to offend the reader that I don't know if I agree with it. I'm not the person to sit here and talk to white people about race. It's not my job to educate you. I don't care to engage in those conversations. But I feel like if you are going to have them, it should be honest. It should be authentic. It should be a book where you're not trying to be politically correct. If you're going to be the black man to have the uncomfortable conversation with, then you should be... I was about to say something inappropriate. You shouldn't be trying to water down all of your responses. And I felt like at one point of the book, he was kind of like begging them to see that white privilege exists, begging them to see that racism still exists today. I need to talk to somebody who read this book and enjoyed it, or read the adult version of this book and enjoyed it, because I have questions. I truly have questions. With that being said, I was still on a hunt to read books by Black authors to see what was happening. And so I ended up reading Between the World and Me, which is like this autobiography of Coates writing to his son. It's kind of like an open letter to his son. And he talks about all of the things that he's dealt with and experienced as a black man, how that shaped his adult life, how that shaped his parenting skills, and the ways that he went about raising a black son. And I thought that it was very beautifully written. I thought that it was authentic. I truly enjoyed it. It's another book that I would recommend. And in terms of what I was looking for from black men, talking to the next generation, talking to their children, and I don't need someone who has all the answers, because in this book he basically says, like, I don't know what it means to be a black man in America yet. I haven't figured it out. But what I can do for you is not to continue to burden you, not to continue to pass on trauma, not to continue to ignore your tears or tell you to man up. I can start to show you more affection and more love. And I really, truly enjoyed that. I want to see more books like this. I want more diversity. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a book. It could be in a movie or a TV or just anybody. I'm just like, I want to see a new vigor, a reinvigoration of directive and inspiration for our black men in America. So those are all of the nonfiction books that I read in the month of February. I'm so sorry for the long video. I definitely went into depth and talked about these books. So let me know how you felt about the video. If you want me to just next time give the summary and like what I thought and that be it, and you guys can just read it yourself, or if you like this kind of like mini diving into the nonfictions and like what it talks about, the context, and like why it's so important, let me know. Also, I've been trying to keep you guys updated on the books that I am getting ready to read that are coming up next on my list, so you guys can look forward to that. And so for that, I'm going to be reading Opium, which is a book about how an ancient flower shaped and poisoned our world. You guys know that a lot of our drug prescriptions actually start with opium, the flower, which has been around since I don't know when. I know that flower is like old as hell. People have fought and died for opium. There was just the opioid epidemic with the Sackler families. Like, this flower has definitely been the cause of a lot of catastrophic events in humanity's history, and I'm very interested to dive into it and find out more information about it. Thanks guys for watching my video. If you have made it to the end, let me know what book, if any, you will be picking up. Also, if not, leave me a recommendation, because I'm in my nonfiction bag. I want to read some more. Bye guys.